Hi, this is John Grant with the REI Policy Institute. The REI Policy Institute is a lobbying effort funded by Tampa investor Randy Patrick. The objective of the effort is to improve policies governing distressed property purchases and sales. You can learn more about our work, reipolicy.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can join us on Facebook as well. We have a new newsletter coming out this month. It should be out. I should be finished today with it. That will kind of set up the fall agenda. The big ticket item there will be the Mortgage Forgiveness Debt Relief Act, the short sale tax break, kind of the work that's been going on with that. I've been doing some work with Congress and trying to figure out what's going to happen, whether we're going to get an extension again or whether this is just going to seep over into 2017 and it will become part of a larger debate on tax reform, and we'll just go and see if we can try to make it permanent. But this week, Randy asked me to talk more about the elections. If you look at the last video I did, I spent a lot of time talking about how each candidate may impact housing policy. So I think for most viewers, that's really the one that you want to take a look at. This one is more just kind of some inside baseball in Washington, and to learn about the predictive part of elections. Obviously, after Labor Day, things start to heat up. We start seeing a lot more. The polling data kind of tightens up a bit. The debates will take place, and people will start kind of taking a look at who they think's going to win. I'm sure everyone's seen that. What I wanted to do is sort of bring folks to put a spotlight on how election predictions actually work amongst professionals. Starting at kind of the 30,000 foot level, you generally do an overview of each party. There are more registered Democrats than Republicans. That is certainly an advantage. I think obviously popular vote is irrelevant. It comes down to the Electoral College. When you look at Democrats, generally, they tend to have New York, Illinois, and California locked up. You need 270 to win, and those three states alone put you at well over 100. For the Republicans, the key has been a lock on the South. And it's interesting, in the last couple cycles, we're starting to see, and maybe even a little bit earlier than that, we're starting to see some cracks in the South for the Republicans. Florida, obviously, the big one, the demographics in Florida have changed in the last 20 years in particular, with retirees heading down there. And they have changed the voting in Florida, I think, significantly. The other big factor is Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is as Democratic as any major New York, Chicago, San Fran. That is changing the dynamic of the election in Virginia. I also think North Carolina is another one to take a look at. In North Carolina resides one of the most influential consumer groups that I'll probably talk about. I've talked about in the past, and we'll probably talk about more in the future. But that has changed North Carolina to a larger degree, and kind of put that in play as well. So as we start to forecast, generally the best way to forecast is the number of paths to victory via the Electoral College. More or less, you generally categorize states into very likely for one party or another, and then you have states that are kind of in that up for grabs category. That usually falls, if the polls in the state are within 5%, I think that's often considered kind of the threshold that the state is in play. Usually the margin of error is 3.5%, but we can kind of boost it up to 5, and those are the states that are in play. When you start to look at what are the paths to victory for each candidate, it's clear that Secretary Clinton has many more scenarios within the Electoral College to win. There's really no question about that. I think when you look at Mr. Trump, there are certain necessities. I think Florida and hanging on to the South as much as possible is a necessity. And also you have kind of Ohio being a necessity. And Pennsylvania has really come into play as well in this election as a state that I think Mr. Trump probably needs in order to win. Pennsylvania is one of, in terms of politics, from the D.C. perspective, Pennsylvania is one of those really interesting states. Inside D.C., Pennsylvania, you'll hear people describe it. Basically, they say you got Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and the rest of it is more like Alabama. And it's sort of a microcosm for the country. You have large, heavily populated areas that tend to lean one way, and then suburban and more rural areas that lean politically a completely different way. So it makes it, and really when you start to analyze the election returns in a state like that, it's unreal. You'll see 90%, even though the overall state might fall within a 5% margin of error, the localities don't. It's 90-95% for one candidate, which makes it interesting. So based on those scenarios of how elections are predicted, clearly Secretary Clinton is a prohibitive favorite simply because the number of scenarios under the Electoral College in which she can win far outnumbers the number of scenarios for Mr. Trump. Now, that's as good as yeah, that's how the predictions are done. What does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. At the end of the day, no one can really know what will happen. But when you see these predictions that come out and you see people make predictions, generally that's how it's done. It is a mathematical formula that predicts the number of scenarios in which a candidate can likely win under the Electoral College, and that's how it plays out. And like I said, the number of scenarios for Secretary Clinton far outweighs Mr. Trump. I think the keys, the remaining big ticket items for this election certainly will be the debates. Generally, I think the trap for Mr. Trump in those debates will be the media tends to ask the conservative or Republican candidates oddly specific questions, which isn't to say that they're unfair, but they would say name the leaders of X, Y, and Z, or the ministers of XYZ countries. Very specific questions meant to trip a candidate up and further a narrative of the media that, well, if the person doesn't know who the Minister of Finance is for a particular country, it means that they're stupid. I don't really buy into that. But that's clearly the debate trap that will be set for Mr. Trump, along with prior statements. And I think for Secretary Clinton, you have a more seasoned politician. The trap for her will be the trap that Mr. Trump used for other seasoned and skilled politicians on the Republican side. He doesn't debate like a politician, and I think that works to his advantage often. And if he can have the type of debate he wants with her, where it's more focused on attaching her actions to current problems and essentially, making the argument, look, this person's extremely polished, this person's very likable, but they're completely incompetent. And, I think that's more or less the narrative that he uses, and it's very, very effective, and it's baiting in a sense. You want to get, if you're him, you want to get them out of their comfort zone, and I think that is what he'll try to do on his side. So again, in terms of predictions, again, look, I have to work with whoever becomes president, so it's not really to my benefit to predict or whatever. But what I would say is that this election could go actually, traditional thought would be this is going to be extremely close, and it very well may be. But with so many states that seem to be teetering in this relatively close 5 to even 7% margin, those margins could tighten up. And, it's sort of like if a candidate gets on a hot streak toward the end and can run the table and build some very late momentum, all those borderline states can fall one way or another. So we may not see something at the end of the day under the Electoral College that looks all that close. And then finally, I think the last wild card, and I'll use some examples that I want to be clear, they're in no way pejorative toward anyone. But, Mr. Trump has gotten a lot of votes. But if you look at the media and if you look at his own party, the Republican leadership has more or less sandbagged him completely. Inside Washington, when we talk about Trump, we equate it to sort of professional wrestling and pornography. And I don't mean that in any way to suggest that he's part of that, but the metaphor is this. The metaphor is, no one openly talks a lot about supporting Mr. Trump. Very few people do. Yet he gets an awful lot of votes. Much in the same way, not many people talk about those two industries that I mentioned. Yet they seem to do pretty well for themselves. It's sort of a Washington expression that we have, and I think it's true in this circumstance that he may have a hell of a lot more support than people are willing to admit publicly. But we'll find out. But anyway, that was just some insight into how predictions are done in Washington, and a little bit of insight as to how folks in Washington kind of view what's happening here in a pretty unique election. Again, reipolicy.com. We'll have great content for people in this industry. Newsletter is only $99 annually, so you can support us there. And again, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's a big help if we can get people onto that, so it makes it easier to talk to them. And also you can join us on Facebook as well. So I want to thank Randy Patrick, and want to be sure to check out his sites as well. And I'll be in touch next week. Thank you. Bye.